Welcome to the You Person podcast, a deep dive into how a new way of knowing is developing holistic, innovative leaders at all levels of the organization and changing the way business does business. I'm your host, James Tuznia, and a big shout out to Lindsay Sterling for our highly evocative theme music, Between Twilight. Let's take the Dutch court opening up Shell in a new level of accountability. And how does that reflect on the operating system? Like the why of the operating system?
You might start with the black swan effect or the black swan equation, right? So forever in a world that was less connected, there was an assumption that all swans were white because the only swans encountered in Europe apparently were white. So swans were white. And then Australia comes into the picture and you have black swans in Australia. And now suddenly this concrete, literal thing that, well, if you're talking about swans, swans are white. And then there's another evolution. Suddenly you discover, well, not always. So that analogy, if you will, is saying that that's what we do with much of our assumptions about how the world works. So when you have those major paradigm shifts and you get those black swan anomalies, you'd say that at every order of magnitude, the rules change. So you have this judgment or you have this new development where the Dutch courts are saying, well, yeah, that's a viable thing. You might sue Shell for their part in global climate change. Now suddenly the rules, as the world moves to a new order of magnitude collectively, the rules change. So there's a new level of accountability that is saying that unless as a company you're able to, for one, be less certain of your certainty, but what we're saying is the world of business has operated with a certain set of rules that in this case says we can offshore the accountability for this to the general public. Yeah. We can offshore our expenses, our accountability for the actual costs to the world of the things we do. We can say we can keep our bottom line in a certain place by offshoring that cost to the world, to people, to private citizens, saying the rules, what happens to how we assess our profitability when we actually have to be responsible for the whole picture. So that means the rules of engagement are radically shifting. So then our certainty of our certainty is that's one of the things we can do. We can keep our profits higher by offshoring the actual cost. What happens when that changes in the world? And why weren't you able to see that coming? Why weren't you able to see that coming? Well, the black swan effect isn't always predictable. What is predictable, though, is when we're so certain of our certainty and how that gets in the way of accounting for what isn't accountable yet. And we do get inclination, like I could say that we could have seen that coming. The indicators are that global climate change is coming to a point that's affecting everyone, and it's becoming a pressure point. So on the one hand, you could say, well, I didn't see that coming. On the other hand, if you were reading the Book of Life, you definitely could have seen that coming. Yeah. So it has to do with certainty of our certainty and a willingness to see the wave that's actually moving through that ask you to be less certain of your certainty so you can have a less attached I'm certain of my certain and the rules view. Mm-hmm. There's more I could say about that, but
well, and that's why the Q Person Project, because as the rules of engagement change and the situation is forcing us to look in different places, whether economically or corporately or any of the other categories, we need a new way to address it. We need a new way to observe it, to think, to be able to talk together and start to see there's something different that can emerge here. And without a pathway for how we will do that, we won't be able to take advantage of what's beginning to open in the world. So the Q Person Project is that kind of pathway, that kind of operating system that calls you to a new structure of mind, a new structure of thinking.
I just need Jill to say a few words about the court case, just like you said before, so I can spice it in the beginning.
Yeah, I was looking for it so I could just read what it said, and it just came into my phone, and now I can't find it. But basically it said, a Dutch court today found for the plaintiffs against Shell Oil. And it basically said Shell is accountable for climate change, at least partially accountable for climate change. And the judgment was you must reduce your emissions by 45% immediately. It was Friends of the Earth from somewhere in Europe that brought this suit, and that it happened in The Hague, like in the international court. So it's beginning to open up new rules of engagement.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of tectonics, we could say that
That's good. Yeah.
geologically, that the different layers of the crust of the earth move at different paces. And we have an earthquake when a lower layer isn't allowing the upper layers to move because the upper layers move faster than the lower layers. Without any assessment of good or bad, you just say that closer to the core, layers of the earth move in many cases slower, and the upper layers need to move faster. And when we have an earthquake, it's because that the lower layers in the vertical stacking don't allow the upper layers to move in the way they need to move. And that builds up a certain amount of pressure. And at a certain point, it just breaks through. And one of the more modern ways of assessing what's happening there is we actually have stationary monitoring units. I don't know if it's a pole or whatever it is, that satellites read. And when there's an earthquake in areas that have earthquakes more consistently, you have an earthquake because it built up the pressure and the upper layers moved a little bit. They can now assess that will continue and the aftershocks will continue, or there'll be another major wave moving through because it hasn't moved enough yet. And we can now assess that it moved a few feet, but this marker hit needs to move several more feet before we're done for a while.
Yeah.
So then translating that to the world of business, when we have layers in the hierarchy or the holarchy of the business, and you have people in certain places in the vertical stacking of the company, and they're not open to the movement that the world is calling your company to move to. And you might be present to that because the company might already be feeling the pressure of that. The ability for the company to move in the way it needs to move, in the way the world is actually not just wanting, we're actually demanding it move, such as what happened at The Hague with, or whatever the world court was with Shell. The adjustment the company will need to make means that all the layers of that company need to move at a rate that it needs to move at. And you might find within the company that leaders at certain levels in the vertical stacking of the company, if they can't allow the company as a whole to move at that pace that it needs to, that results in a kind of earthquake effect within that company. And we're seeing it in the world. So that would be why the Hugh-Person operating system would be really helpful, because it allows people to be less certain of their certainty, which makes them a little more fluid in their awareness, which allows the many levels of the, let's say, hopefully moving towards a holarchy instead of a hierarchy, so that all the layers of the company can move at the rate they need to move. So that movement of fluidity of awareness, allowing all the leaders, hopefully, and hopefully the whole company, to move at the rate it needs to move relative to itself in the world, which means less certainty of certainty, more openness, more fluid awareness, more openness to the transformations that actually are being demanded. Not just that, well, it'd be nice if we could make these transformations. There are transformations that actually are being demanded for any particular enterprise to move to where the world is moving to, and for the world itself to where it needs to move.
A Dutch court on Wednesday ruled oil giant Royal Dutch Shell must reduce its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2019 levels. That's a much higher reduction than the company's current aim of lowering its emissions 20% by 2030. What Shell is saying is they're investing billions of dollars in low carbon energy, including electric vehicle charging, hydrogen, renewables, blah, 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 and that we just can't do it faster than what we're doing it. This particular lawsuit was filed in April 2019 by 7 activist groups, including Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, on behalf of 17,000 Dutch citizens, claiming that Shell's business model is endangering human rights and lives by posing a threat to the global goals laid out in the Paris Agreement. That's an example of what you're talking about, Daniel.
And for that company, when the company says we can't do it, we can't do it from a certain way of looking at things, for a certain structure of mind. So then just to say we can't do it, we're saying that with a different level of operating system, one could say that's not a response that's viable. That might correlate to what used to be called the Steve Jobs effect, where the engineers would say, well, you just can't do that. And you'd say, well, you will do it and get it done. So then when the court says to you 45%, whatever that was, and you're saying, well, 20% we can do maybe, and that probably was, they thought that was hopeful, that we can't do it is not a viable response in the world we're in, because the world will say you will do that, and then there'll be some legal consequence perhaps. So then it's saying that the operating system would say that wouldn't be your response. Your response would say, okay, this is what the world's asking for. Where do we need to shift to actually meet that?
Yeah.
So when you say we can't do it, that's a level of certainty of their certainty, or at least they want to present that as a certainty. We're saying that in the world we're moving to, your response would be, okay, now how are we going to do that?
Coming from their certainty about their certainty, they're projecting that it'll get tied up in the courts because they will come back into the courts and say, well, we can't do that. And this is blah, 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 blah. And it also is a turning point in the world for people to now put lawsuits against the big polluters. So to Daniel's point, rather than just let's move it and let's see how to move it and let's go find the ways to get the support we need to move it, they're using their certainty about their certainty to now put it into the courts, which is creating its own kind of tectonic force when it could be much simpler and much easier.
And it could totally be that they want to project a certainty that gives them legal cover.
Yep.
Like they might even say, well, maybe we could do that. It would just cost our profitability.
Yep.
So let's say that we can't do it. And there's some evidence for it being a certainty that it can't be done.
Right.
Whether any particular enterprise will be able to continue to use that as a strategy is the question as the world moves. Because the world would say, yeah, that's just blah, blah, woof, woof. And you will do this.
Yeah.
Or you won't be a company anymore.
Yeah.
We will impose a judgment financially.
Yeah.
Or whatever that is. If that happens to be, how will you dance with that?
Yeah.
And we're saying you could defend it. You may try to defend it, and the world might not really be okay with your defense.
Yeah.
So then if the rules of engagement are shifting in as radical a way as they might possibly do, how will your enterprise dance with that?
Mm-hmm.
So rather than defending your certainty or the projected certainty, and rather defending your defense, could you be open and fluid enough as an enterprise to say, if the world changes that radically, how will we stay in business? Or how will we maintain some kind of viability in this world?
Yeah.
That might require a different structure of mind that allows you to dance with that fluidly and elegantly. Elegance being nothing more to add, nothing more to subtract, so that you can be up to the challenge.
Yeah.
That is the challenge of our 21st century.
Yeah, it is.
And if business is going to be the remedy rather than the malady, then it will have to answer that question.
Some of what people are saying out of this, many of the groups that are following this really have said this one statement: big oil can no longer dismiss the crucial role it has to play in the fight against climate change. Meaning, the wave is coming. You can change it now with the kind of choice that you're pointing to, Daniel, or you could get forced to do it and cost a lot, have you pay a much bigger price than if you consciously chose to do something different and find the support.
And it's not unlikely that if that movement gets momentum, it's not unlikely that will then move to the agricultural industrial complex.
That's right.
Because agriculture in the agricultural industrial complex fashion of creating something that looks like food is also majorly contributing to climate change.
Yeah, it is.
So if that moves to oil, it will move to agriculture at some point.
Yeah.
And so then the rules of engagement on many industrial fronts will have to engage this question.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the You Person podcast. If you are new to the podcast, please head over to our website, theyoupersonproject.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast, learn more about the project, or connect with our team. You can also reach us at hello@theyoupersonproject.com. If you think of someone who will benefit from listening to this podcast, please do share it with them. Thank you again, and see you on the next episode of the You Person Podcast.